Hello Year 9. Today's lesson is on how did life change for German Jews after 1938. It's very closely linked with what you've just done, with looking at how life was changing before 1938. And so I wanted to start off just by showing you two sources that give us a little bit of a sense of how much life had changed by the start of 1938. Before I do that, if you just write your title in for me, you should be working on paper in your book or on a Word document and making sure you're keeping all your work safe, ready for when we return to school. So if you could write your title in first and then press play to hear about these sources. Okay, so both of these sources are disturbing in different ways. One of them shows the social persecution of Jewish people, and that is the one on the left here, source 3.5. This is a page from an anti-Semitic book called Trust No Fox in the Green Meadow and No Jew on His Oath. It's written by a school teacher and it was published in 1936 and spread throughout German schools. It gives us a couple of different ideas. The first is the anti-Semitic portrayal of the Jewish man in this picture. So he has a couple of the typical features that Nazis like to portray Jewish people as having. So he's quite fat. They're trying to imply that he's greedy. He's wearing dark clothing. He's looking suspicious. And what's happened here is supposedly this Jewish person has just gone to be baptized in a church. But at the bottom of the page, it says, baptism didn't make him into a non-Jew. So this was a really important part of Jewish anti-Semitism. It was the idea that a Jewish person would always be a Jew, even if they didn't believe in Judaism or they converted to a different religion. And this was trying to convince the German population that Jewish people were biologically different. Now, this wasn't true, but it was an important part of the Nazis' argument because when they started persecuting Jewish people, a Jewish person couldn't escape persecution by saying, I'm not Jewish, because if their three grandparents were Jewish, then according to the Nazis, they were Jewish. So this gives us a kind of sense of the kind of images that German children were seeing in schools. And this had become commonplace by 1936. This was normal. So anti-Semitism was in every part of daily life. In contrast, on the right, we can see an example of violent persecution. Now, interestingly, this happened really early on in the Nazis' time in power. So this was March 1933. Hitler had only been Chancellor for 2 months. And we can see here Michael Siegel. He was a German Jew working as a lawyer in Munich. And he went to complain to the police when one of his clients was unlawfully arrested. And as he was complaining to the police, he was attacked by SA, Nazi stormtroopers, by the brown shirts. They knocked out his teeth. They hit him so hard that one of his eardrums burst. And then they forced him to march through Munich whilst carrying this sign saying, I'll never complain to the police again. Now, this is unusual only in that it was happening so early, because the government did not start widespread violent persecution until later on in the 1930s. But here we can see that even in the early 1930s, violent persecution was happening. So we've got the two sides of persecution here, the more social persecution and the violent persecution. But interestingly, both of these types of persecution were designed to persuade German people that persecution of Jewish people was correct, that was the right thing for Germany to be doing. And this, we know, was at least partly effective because German people did not, there wasn't considerable opposition to the treatment of Jewish people, as we'll see in this lesson. And that was a really important part of the Nazis' tactics. Before we start looking at persecution that occurred after 1938, we need to understand that after 1938, there were more German Jews than there had been beforehand. That's because Germany itself was growing. Now, when Hitler took power, one of his key arguments was that that Germany needed to expand in order to be as strong as it deserved to be. And on this map, we get a sense of how Hitler achieved this. So the dark section is Germany in 1933. The Rhineland, which has the stripes on it, that was always part of Germany. but it had been forcibly demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles, and that was remilitarized in 1936. And that was the first example of Hitler attempting to use his army to expand Germany's power. When Britain and France did nothing to prevent Hitler from marching into the Rhineland, Hitler decided to become a bit more bold. He first of all sent his army to march into Austria and persuaded the Austrian government to hold something that was called a plebiscite. This was a vote. All Austrians could take part in the vote, apart from Jewish Austrians. And the vote basically asked the people, would you like to become part of Germany? And the majority of Austrians chose to become part of Germany. So the area in kind of a light pink in Austria became part of what then became known as Greater Germany. Hitler also took over the Sudetenland, which is the area of Czechoslovakia which is in a light pink. And that area had mostly German speakers living in it. And so Hitler could justify taking the Sudetenland, arguing that Germans in Czechoslovakia were being treated badly. And Britain and France accepted that. In 1939, Hitler decided to become even more extreme in his international policy, and you can see that the darker area of Czechoslovakia became part of Greater Germany in 1939. So the Jewish people that we are talking about in this lesson aren't just Jewish people that lived inside what Germany had been. They were the Jewish people of Greater Germany, and that included Austrian Jews and Czechoslovakian Jews as well. So I want to focus on the Anschluss in particular. The Anschluss is the name that Austrian and German people gave to when Austria joined Greater Germany. And that happened on the 12th of March 1938. Many Austrians were really happy to see the German army arrive, because Germany was much stronger in terms of its economy than Austria. Austria had also suffered during the First World War, and so had been a relatively weak country in the years after World War One. So to be united with such a strong country as Germany seemed like a really positive thing for many of them. Now, when the Nazi Party took over Austria in 1938, they were in a very different position that they had been in 1933 when they took over Germany. They were no longer seen as an upstart party that wouldn't be in power very long, as they had been in Germany in 1933. They had been ruling Germany for the past 5 years. There were no other political parties. Democracy had been ended. And so they were in a very strong position. They also had a very strong army. In 1933, the Nazis didn't have control of the army, and the army was only 100,000 people. But by 1938, the Nazis had conscription, so men had been joining the army, not out of volunteering, but they'd been forced to join the army for 2 years. They also were feeling confident because they had concentration camps built in Germany. They knew that they could send prisoners to those concentration camps, and that would allow them to remove any opposition that existed in Austria. So basically in 1938, the Nazi Party was much more confident than they had been in 1933. And they also had the overwhelming approval of the Austrian people. In 1933, Hitler had only won 1/3 of the vote in the election that made him Chancellor, but he had a far higher proportion of votes in Austria. So he was much more confident in the way he went about governing Austria in 1938. The Jewish people that lived there were immediately targeted by the Nazi Party and also by their fellow Austrians. And all of the anti-Jewish laws that had been slowly introduced in Germany were very suddenly introduced in Austria. And the government immediately started trying to take the wealth of Austrian Jewish people. So they took control of shops, businesses, factories, and there were frequent attacks on Jewish people. I just want to show you an example of one of those attacks. This photograph shows Jewish adults in Austria being supervised by members of the Hitler Youth and being forced to scrub the streets in Vienna immediately after the Anschluss. The fact that the Hitler Youth were given the power to force adults to behave in this way shows how quickly the hierarchy shifted in Austria after the Anschluss. Suddenly, teenagers are able to force adult Jewish people to perform this incredibly humiliating act. And clearly, the reason why they're getting away with this is that there's lots of Austrians standing around and holding back a very big crowd. Now, this crowd aren't doing anything to try and stop this from happening. They're accepting it. They might be watching with horror, but they're not doing anything. So they were clearly accepting this humiliating treatment of Jewish people. And this must have been an incredible shock for Jews who had previously lived side by side Austrians in Vienna and now being treated differently by their friends and neighbours. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and have a go at the task at the bottom of the sheet. So why was it possible for the Nazis to introduce anti-Jewish laws so quickly in Austria? And you can use the information that is on your page now as well. I want to take the chance to link back to the Kleinmans here because the Kleinmans lived in Vienna, so they were some of the people who was experiencing this sudden change in the way that Jewish people were being treated. Now, the Kleinmans would have been very, very concerned about Nazi control of Austria and the fact that now they were suddenly part of Greater Germany. Many of their friends who weren't Jewish reassured the Kleinmans, told the Kleinmans that they would support them. However, others began to treat the Kleinmans very differently, and we'll see how that progressed in just a second. From 1938 onwards, more anti-Semitic laws were introduced across Greater Germany. We can see some examples on here. A lot of these laws were passed to make it easier for the government to identify Jewish people, just from looking at their names or from looking at their papers. So, for example, in August 1938, Jews with non-Jewish first names had to adopt an additional name, Israel for men and Sarah for women. By non-Jewish first names, that would have meant names taken from the Old Testament or from the Torah, so names that had religious significance to Jewish people, and most Jewish people would not necessarily have had Jewish names, and yet they were forced to take on a new name that made them more easily identifiable. They also had to, from October, be given new passports stamped with the letter J. So if they tried to leave Greater Germany, the Nazis would know to treat them differently. More specifically, those Jews who were trying to leave Greater Germany would have to pay a special tax that made it more difficult for them to leave. So this was this kind of weird situation where in many things that the Nazis were doing were encouraging Jewish people to leave, but at the same time they were also making it so expensive to leave that many couldn't afford to. The other thing that was happening in 1938 and 39 is that the Nazis were taking the wealth of Jewish people. So that included very high taxes, taking away Jewish businesses, taking away Jewish possessions like jewellery, and also actually evicting Jewish people from houses that they rented so that those houses could be given to non-Jewish people. In 1938, the most violent persecution of Jewish people of the 1930s occurred, and that followed a speech made by Joseph Goebbels, which encouraged loyal Nazis in Greater Germany to target Jewish businesses, to damage their property and their wealth. Now that night after the speech, the members of the SS and the SA, who had already been given orders to start to carry out violence, members of these organisations led a wave of violence against Jewish people, their homes and businesses. Although many ordinary Germans joined in with that violence, it was definitely led by members of the SS and the SA. Many of the members of these military organisations were dressed in plain clothes rather than their normal uniforms to try and make it look like they were ordinary Germans that were just involved in spontaneous violence rather than people who were following orders. Now, this event has been called various different names, either the November Pogrom or Kristallnacht, which is kind of translates as the Night of Broken Glass, reflecting the damage that had been done to Jewish businesses, like the one I'll show you now. So this is typical of the kind of damage that was done during Kristallnacht. You can see that this is obviously a business. We've got the business owner probably returning here to find that all of the glass has been smashed and all of the items within the shop have been stolen. And so ordinary Germans, Austrians, Czechs took part in this looting. And although it was led by members of the SS and the SA, and that they were encouraging ordinary people to take part, ordinary Germans did take part. They did benefit from this, benefit financially. And this reflects just how much German attitudes had changed by 1938, that so many ordinary Germans would be willing to take part in the destruction of their neighbour's property. So at the same time on that night, many Jewish people were killed, usually for trying to resist the damage that was being done to the property, and around 30,000 men were put into concentration camps, where, as you know, the treatment was incredibly bad. Very difficult labour had to be carried out. They were assaulted by members of the SS and could be tortured or killed. So what I would like you to do is to have a think about this question. So Hitler argued that ordinary German people had carried out the violence, and German newspapers were told to ignore the fact that the SA and the SS had led the violence. So what I want you to do is to have a think. Why was it that that Hitler wanted ordinary German people to be the ones who carried out the violence? Why did Hitler want people to think that it was ordinary Germans who were responsible rather than members of the Nazi Party? So how might this benefit Hitler? Okay, so if you pause your video now and have a go at that. Because that was quite a difficult question, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I think the answer should be. So feel free to add anything to your notes if you were struggling. So Hitler really wanted ordinary Germans to be seen as responsible because he wanted to convince the German population that the majority of Germans were anti-Jewish, that the majority of Germans hated Jews. This, he thought, was really important because if there was anyone in Germany, and there were many people in Germany who were feeling uncomfortable with the way that Jewish people were being treated, who were tempted to resist this treatment, who were tempted to complain about what was happening to Jewish people, Hitler wanted those people that were having doubts about the way Jewish people were treated, he wanted them to believe that no one would support them, that they were the only ones that had that view, that the vast majority of Germans wanted Jewish people to suffer. And so he wanted to make people who were supporting Jewish people, he wanted to make them feel alone and scared so that they would no longer support Jewish people vocally. So that was a really important part of his tactics. He needed people to believe that the majority of Germans were anti-Jewish, so that anyone who wasn't anti-Jewish would be scared to stand up and say anything. The Kleinmans were affected very badly by Kristallnacht, or by, as they called it, the November pogrom. During the night of the 9th of November, the Kleinmans' neighbours came to their house and forced Gustav and Fritz, who I will highlight on here. So this is Gustav, just here, and this is Fritz, just here. So Gustav and Fritz were taken to the police station. They were both beaten brutally, despite the fact that Fritz was just 15 years old. And what was even more disturbing is that actually the people who came to the Kleinmans' house to arrest Gustav and Fritz, they were led by some of the Kleinmans' closest friends. So non-Jewish people led a mob to the Kleinmans' house in order to arrest their friends. And that shows just how quickly attitudes had turned towards Austrian Jews. Tini, who was the mother, you can see her sitting down on the right, she began immediately to try to get her children out of Austria following Kristallnacht. And that was a response that many, particularly Austrian Jews, had. Is that immediately they realised we need to get out of Austria because otherwise we're in danger. Teenie had very little money. That was made even more difficult by the huge taxes that Austrian Jewish people were being forced to pay. She contacted Jewish charities in America, who would help to get her children out. Now, even though the charities did want to help, the American government made it very difficult. And the only person that the American government agreed to allow into the country was Kurt. Kurt is the youngest boy who you can see here sitting on Gustav's lap. And because Kurt was under the age of 10, he was allowed in. But Herta, who was still a teenager, was not. Edith was an adult, so she was able to find someone to sponsor her in the UK, actually in Leeds. And that family needed a servant, so they agreed to support Edith's travels to Leeds. But Herta and Fritz were unable to leave the country. So to go back to the night of the 9th of November when Fritz and Gustav were arrested, they were actually let go the following day. But then the Kleinmans spent nearly a year in fear of what would happen next. And a couple of times, members of the SS came to the house and asked to see Gustav. And Teenie would say, truthfully, Gustav was out at those times, so Teenie would say he's out. And then would spend the next few days worrying, are they going to come back? If Gustav is here, are they going to arrest him? And eventually they did come back when Gustav was there. And they arrested both Gustav and Fritz and sent Gustav and Fritz to Buchenwald concentration camp. And the two men were to remain in concentration camps. They didn't get their freedom. So we can see that in 1938 the persecution becomes violent, but in 1939 it becomes even more so because Jewish men were removed from their homes in large numbers and sent to concentration camps where they were treated incredibly badly. So what I would like you to do is to describe at least 2 ways in which Kristallnacht changed the life of the Kleinman family. I've actually mentioned, I think, 4 ways that it changed the life of the Kleinman family, so you should definitely be able to describe 2. If you pause your video now to have a go at that. One of the ways that you might have written down that the Kristallnacht changed the Kleinman family's life was they convinced them that emigration was necessary. Emigration is when you leave your country and start a new life somewhere else. And particularly after 1938, many Jewish people living in Germany or living in Greater Germany decided to try and emigrate to other countries. Now, the Austrian Jewish population did this most successfully. So by 1939, 3/4 of the Jewish population of Austria had managed to leave. However, most Jewish people that were from what had originally been Germany, they actually stayed, and half of the Kleinman family stayed as well. Now, this was because those who wanted to leave needed to have money to do so. They had to pay a special tax because they were Jewish. They had to pay an exit tax on leaving the country and give up all their possessions. So they needed to be confident that they were going to a country where they'd been able to send money or where they knew people who had money. That was even more difficult. To try and find a country who would take Jewish immigrants was very hard. Britain and America were agreeing to take some, but that was mostly the very young children, so even teenagers wouldn't be able to leave Greater Germany. So there were lots of different reasons why Jewish people struggled to leave. So could you answer that question for me, which is at the bottom of your screen? So why did most German Jews remain in Germany? So, having a look at violent persecution of Jewish Germans more generally, in the years 1933 to 37, The persecution experienced by German Jews was sometimes violent, as we saw at the beginning of the lesson, with the lawyer who was beaten up very badly for complaining to the police. So that violence did happen occasionally. However, more often the violence was economic or social. So just to have a look at the differences between economic persecution and social persecution. Economic persecution is when laws were introduced that made it more difficult for Jews to earn money, so excluding them from certain jobs, for example. Social persecution was when Jewish people were excluded from German society. So, for example, when they were refused entry to sports clubs. And also when an atmosphere of prejudice was created towards Jews. So we saw that, for example, in the school textbook, and also the impact that had, because Germans voluntarily put up signs outside towns and villages saying Jews unwelcome here. So what I want you to have a go at now is to think back to your lesson on social persecution and economic persecution. How did social persecution of Jewish people affect the attitudes of non-Jewish Germans? Okay, so pause your video now and have a go at that question. So hopefully you've got down something like it encouraged German people to be more anti-Semitic. Particularly, you might have linked to German children who were being taught race theory and were being told that Jewish people were inferior to themselves. You might have linked to the fact that many Germans, without being told to, put up signs that said that Jewish people weren't welcome in their towns, and that shows just how much Germans had taken on Nazi anti-Semitism. You might have linked to the propaganda that the Nazis published, and the fact that because German people were constantly exposed to anti-Semitic ideas, eventually they started to accept those ideas. So you could have any of those answers, but if you think that my answers were a bit more detailed there, see if you can add something to yours. So thinking about the fact that this economic and social persecution existed between 1933 and 1937, and that during that time there wasn't very much widespread violence towards Jewish people, even though violence did exist. That started to change very quickly in 1938 and 39, when the persecution of Jewish people in Greater Germany became much, much more violent, and Jewish people were arrested in large numbers, convincing Jewish people that they needed to emigrate. Now, I just want to think for a second about why violent persecution wasn't introduced in 1933. Why was it that the Nazis came to power in 1933 and didn't introduce widespread violent persecution until 1938? Well, the reason for that is that violent persecution of the Jews relied on the compliance of non-Jewish Germans. Compliance means that you accept something that's happening. So it doesn't necessarily mean you support it, but you accept it, you go along with it, you do what you're told without complaint. Now, very few Germans did anything to help Jews or to protest against the violence used at Kristallnacht. That was because by that point, the Nazis had managed to convince many Germans that Jewish people were different from them. They were a threat, they were inferior, and ultimately that Jewish people weren't worth protecting. Even if the Nazis hadn't managed to convince Germans that that was true, most Germans had got to the point where they were no longer prepared to intervene to protect Jewish people because that would have put their own lives at risk. Now, the Nazis knew that a period of time was needed before violent persecution of this scale was introduced, because German people needed to be convinced not to protect Jews. Bear in mind that German people had been living alongside Jewish families in German cities for hundreds of years. So if Hitler had introduced violence on the scale of the 1938 violence in 1933, this would have been, it would have caused shock. It would have been something that people were horrified by. So people needed those years between 1933 and 1938. They needed those kind of 5 years of preparation in order to become compliant. Eventually, the Nazis were able to use violent persecution against Jewish people because they were convinced that non-Jews could accept the violence. So I hope that will help you to answer that final question for me, please. So could you pause the video now and answer the question, why did the Nazis not introduce widespread violent persecution of Jews in 1933? Well done, Year 9. You've got to the end of the lesson and to the end of the work for this fortnight. This lesson, you should have written an answer to 6 different questions. Now, obviously, in a lesson that you would have at school, you would normally do quite a lot of writing in 50 minutes. So please make sure that your answer to those 6 questions is of a quality that your teacher would expect to see if you were in a lesson. The work should have taken you 50 minutes. So obviously this video is half an hour long, so you should have been writing for a full 20 minutes. Okay, so look back at your answers. Have you written enough? Could you include any more detail? Make sure you keep your work safe. You don't need to send it to your teacher, but you do need to keep it safe to stick into your book when you return to school, and your teacher will be checking your work then. Very well done, Year 9, and you'll hear from me again next week when we're continuing to look at how the situation in Germany developed.